Psychologists, which patient made you tremble with fear? As a psychologist, you learn to rely on data, science, and observation. You separate reality from imagination, or at least you think you do. I always knew I'd encounter challenging patients, people with deep traumas, irrational fears, or dark thoughts. But nothing prepared me for the man with the black notebook. I remember it vividly. It was a cold afternoon, the kind where the wind rattles the windows and the sky seems ready to collapse. My secretary told me the new patient, 𝗣𝗦𝗬𝗖𝗛𝗢𝗟𝗢𝗚𝗦, had requested an urgent appointment, claiming it was a matter of life and death. There was something in his voice that unsettled me, a deep, almost monotonous tone, as if the words weighed heavily on him. When he entered my office, I couldn't help but feel a chill. He was tall, thin, around 40 years old, with a gaunt face and deep dark circles that gave him an almost cadaverous expression. But what caught my attention most was the black notebook he clutched under his arm, old, with worn corners, held so tightly his knuckles were white. We sat across from each other, and for a few minutes he said nothing, just stared at me intently as if evaluating me. I was used to uncomfortable silences in sessions, but this was different. There was something in his gaze that made me feel like I was the patient. "Mauricio, right?" I finally asked, trying to break the tension. He nodded slowly. "What brings you here?" I continued. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked down at the notebook and opened it with precise movements. The pages were filled with strange symbols, drawings of humanoid figures, and phrases repeated over and over. I caught a glimpse of some. "The shadows are always watching. There's no escape. They're here." "They," he said in a low voice, almost a whisper. "Who are they?" I asked, careful not to show surprise, assuming it was a hallucination or some form of persecutory delusion, common in patients with schizophrenia or psychotic disorders. Mauricio looked up and stared directly into my eyes. "The shadows," he replied with chilling seriousness. "They're everywhere. You can't see them, but they see you." I jotted notes in my pad, trying to stay calm. It was important not to validate his beliefs outright, but also not to challenge them too soon. "When did you first notice them?" I asked. "Since I was a child," he said. "At first, I thought they were part of my imagination. But over the years, I learned they're always there waiting." There was something in his voice that sent shivers down my spine, not the content of his words, but the conviction with which he spoke. He didn't seem like a man lost in his own mind. He seemed like someone who had seen things others couldn't. The following sessions only deepened my unease. Mauricio spoke more about the shadows, how they watched him when he was alone, how they whispered his name in the dark. But what disturbed me most was that, little by little, he began revealing details about my life. "How's your daughter?" he asked casually one afternoon. My stomach nodded. I had never shared anything about my family with him. I never disclosed personal details to patients. "How do you know I have a daughter?" I asked, trying to sound calm. "They told me," he said. "The shadows know everything about you." For a moment I was speechless. It was impossible for him to know that, but his expression was one of absolute certainty. From that day on, I started having nightmares. I dreamed of dark figures moving in the corners of my room, of whispers calling my name. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, sweating, with the feeling that someone was watching me from the nearest shadow. The worst came one night after a particularly tense session. Mauricio had shown me one of his drawings, a circular symbol surrounded by crisscrossing lines, vaguely familiar but unidentifiable. He said it was a mark the shadows left on those they wanted to take. That night, when I got home, I saw it, the same symbol drawn on my front door in what looked like ash or dark dust. I looked around, expecting to see someone, but the street was empty. My heart racing, I wiped the mark away as best I could and went inside. From that moment, my life spiraled into paranoia. The noises in my house seemed amplified, shadows stretched unnaturally, and I constantly felt watched. I finally decided to refer Mauricio to another specialist. I needed to distance myself from his case to regain my sanity. But the fear didn't leave. Even now, years later, I sometimes find that symbol in random places, on a fogged-up window, in the dust on a shelf, on the wall of my office. I erase it immediately, but the feeling of being watched never fully goes away. I've come to accept that there may be things we don't understand, things hiding in the dark corners of our perception. And every time a shadow stretches in an empty room, I wonder if 𝗣𝗬𝗬𝗖𝗛𝗢𝗍 was right. If the shadows are always there, watching, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. 𝗣𝗦𝗬𝗬𝗖𝗛. Being a psychologist has taught me that the mind can construct astonishing realities, some so detailed and vivid that they become hard to distinguish from what we call reality. Patients with hallucinations often describe terrifying experiences that defy logic, but what happened with this patient was something I never expected to witness. Even today, I can't look at a mirror without feeling a shadow of that fear lingering. Her name was Valeria, a young woman of about 25. She came to my office with a prior diagnosis of dissociative disorder, though her mother warned me her symptoms had worsened. During our first session, Valeria seemed withdrawn, her eyes fixed on the floor, responding in monosyllables and avoiding eye contact. It wasn't until I mentioned mirrors that she snapped her head up as if I'd read her mind. "Why did you mention that?" she asked, her voice tense. I explained that her file noted an obsession with mirrors. She seemed to fear them but also needed them in some way. Valeria stared at me with an intensity that made me uneasy. "They don't want me to talk about it," she murmured. I frowned. "Who are they?" After a moment's hesitation, she said something that chilled me. "The others. The ones who live in the reflection." I thought it might be a personification of her trauma, so I tried to probe further, but she shut down, whispering, "If I talk too much, they get angry." The following sessions were a slow descent into the unknown. Valeria explained that since childhood, she felt her reflection had a life of its own. Not like a normal reflection that mimics your movements. She said there were moments when her reflection froze or moved before she did, as if out of sync with time. At first, I thought these were delusions, a product of her fragmented mind, but her descriptions were too detailed, too consistent. She spoke of the other Valeria as an entity with its own intentions, someone living in the mirror who knew things she couldn't explain. "Sometimes she talks to me," she confessed one afternoon. "She tells me things I don't want to know." "What kind of things?" I asked, noting in my pad. "Secrets. Things about other people. Things I can only see when she shows me." I asked for an example. Valeria hesitated, as if afraid to betray someone invisible. Finally, she lowered her voice and said something that left me cold. "Do you remember the receptionist?" I nodded. "She's sick, very sick," the other Valeria told me. "She showed me how her organs are failing inside." The claim seemed absurd. The receptionist, though older, had always been in good health. But 2 weeks later, her daughter came to the office to inform me her mother had been urgently hospitalized for kidney failure. That incident left me pensive, but I tried not to dwell on it. Things grew more unsettling. One day, Valeria arrived with a small hand mirror wrapped in black cloth, holding it carefully as if it were sacred or dangerous. "Can we use this in the session?" she asked. "I want you to see what I see." I agreed reluctantly. She placed the antique mirror, its silver frame tarnished by time, on the table between us. For several minutes, nothing happened. Valeria stared at it, her lips moving in a barely audible murmur. I watched curiously, waiting for a reaction. Then it happened, something I can't explain. The reflection in the mirror seemed wrong. At first, I thought it was an optical illusion caused by the light's angle, but no. Valeria was still, but her reflection seemed to breathe independently. I leaned closer to examine it. Then the reflection turned and looked directly into my eyes. My blood froze. Valeria remained motionless, but her reflection was smiling at me. "Did you see it?" she asked, as if she knew exactly what had happened. "I think it was an optical illusion," I stammered, trying to regain composure. "It's not an illusion," she replied. "Now they've seen you too." I didn't know how to respond. We ended the session shortly after, but from that day things worsened. I began noticing anomalies in my own home. Mirrors vibrated slightly, as if something wanted to escape. Sometimes, passing a mirror, I felt my reflection didn't move in sync with me. One night, while brushing my teeth, I clearly saw someone behind me in the mirror. When I turned, no one was there. The sessions with Valeria grew more intense. She claimed the others were becoming more present and warned me not to look at them directly, or they could cross over. I tried to rationalize her words, but deep down I began doubting my own perception. The last time I saw her, Valeria was pale and nervous. She handed me the mirror, still wrapped in black cloth. "I can't keep it anymore," she said. "It's yours now. They chose you." I tried to refuse, but she insisted. I left it in the office, thinking it was part of her psychological transference. But that night, in a dream, I saw something I'll never forget. A room full of mirrors, all reflecting shadows whispering my name. One shadow approached the glass, and as it reached out toward me, I woke up startled. Since then, I've covered all the mirrors in my house. I don't know what really happened with Valeria, but I know it wasn't just psychological. Sometimes, in the quietest nights, I hear those whispers again. When I pass a mirror, I avoid looking directly at it because I know if I do, they'll be waiting. Case 3. Cases with children are always complex. Their perception of reality is still forming, their fears often exaggerated, and it's sometimes hard to distinguish deep trauma from an overactive imagination. But Andres' case was different from the start. Something in his behavior made me feel there was a dark truth behind his words, one I could never fully understand. Even today, I sometimes feel those whispers he described still echoing in my mind. Andres was 8 years old when his mother brought him to my office. He was a thin boy with large, dark eyes and an expression that didn't match his age, always alert as if expecting something terrible to happen. His mother, visibly worried, explained that for months, Andres had been having recurring nightmares and talking to himself, especially at night. "He says he has imaginary friends, but what he says about them is strange," she told me during the initial interview. "What kind of things does he say?" I asked, noting in my pad. "He talks about people who are dead, names we don't know, but he says he's heard them in the house." That caught my attention. While children often invent stories, mentioning deceased people was unusual. I decided to start with an individual session to evaluate Andres directly. At first, he was reserved, avoiding eye contact and staying silent, fidgeting with his hands. But when I offered him paper and crayons to draw, his demeanor changed. "What would you like to draw, Andres?" I asked with a smile. He stared at me for a few seconds, then said, "Them." The response unsettled me, but I didn't interrupt. He began drawing rapid lines on the paper. What emerged was disturbing. Human-like figures with deformed faces and completely black eyes, standing in a circle around what looked like a door or threshold. "Who are they?" I asked gently, trying to hide my discomfort. "They're my friends," he replied without looking up. "They live in the house, but they're not always there. They only come when they want to play." His tone was neutral, almost as if he were talking about something perfectly normal. I probed further. "Since when have you known them?" "Since we moved," he said. "At first, I only saw them in my dreams, but then they started talking to me when I was awake." My skin prickled slightly. Auditory hallucinations aren't uncommon in children with anxiety or trauma, but something about how he described these figures didn't feel like a mere product of imagination. "What do they say?" I asked, trying to sound calm. Andres stopped drawing and looked at me directly. His eyes held a strange mix of innocence and something darker, something that shouldn't be in a child's gaze. "They say he's waiting," he whispered. The rest of the session was calmer, but those words stayed with me. I researched the house they'd moved into, looking for records of accidents, disappearances, or unexplained phenomena. Though I'm not superstitious, the information made my stomach sink. The following sessions with Andres only deepened my unease. His drawings grew more detailed, showing the figures with increasingly defined features. Sometimes he described scenes that seemed straight out of a horror movie. Doors opening on their own, voices calling from dark corners of his room, shadows gliding across walls. One afternoon, while we talked, Andres stopped mid-sentence and stared at a corner of the office, frowning as if listening to something I couldn't hear. "Andres, everything okay?" I asked, following his gaze. He didn't respond immediately. Then slowly he said, "They're here. They came to see you." The air in the room felt heavier. I laughed nervously, trying to break the tension. "And what do they want?" "Just to watch," he whispered. After that session, things changed for me. I started having strange experiences at home. At night, I heard whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. Sometimes, when I turned off the lights, I saw shadows moving in the corners as if someone were watching from the darkness. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself it was just suggestion from Andres' case, but things worsened. One night, I woke with the feeling that someone was standing at the foot of my bed. I turned on the light quickly, but no one was there. Yet, I saw a strange mark on the wall, like small handprints. I decided to confront my fears and talk to Andres about what was happening. During our next session, I explained what I'd been experiencing. He listened calmly, showing no surprise. "They do that sometimes," he said. "They like to follow people who can see them." "See them?" I repeated, a knot forming in my stomach. "Yes," he said. "Now they see you too." That was our last session. Soon after, Andres' mother told me they were moving to another state. I never heard from them again. But the strange phenomena didn't stop immediately. For weeks, I kept hearing whispers and seeing fleeting shadows and mirrors. Over time, the incidents became less frequent but never fully stopped. Even now, on the quietest nights, I feel something watching from the dark corners of my house. I don't know what Andres saw, but I know it wasn't just a product of his mind. Some children are more sensitive to things adults can't perceive, and sometimes those things follow them, and those who dare to listen to their stories